Welcome back, folks around the world. Hopefully, everyone's been enjoying all the expertise and stage-oriented entrepreneurs that we've been bringing to the table, and really just collecting insights and making connections. So now, to continue the journey and really talk about what it takes to be able to one start an idea, take it through that growth phase, exit the company and then do it all over again is going to be Samir Kumar Patel, who is Thailand charter member. And Samir is an engineer with obviously that entrepreneur spirit. He is currently the co-founder and CEO of Moonlight Therapeutics. What Moonlight Therapeutics does is that they focus on improving the quality of life for people with food allergies by providing patent-friendly treatments. And what Samir is going to really do here is that he's going to break down his journey from his previous startup, what that looked like, the lessons learned, and now really diving into how he has been able to utilize the ecosystem here in Atlanta to continue on that growth phase into the company that he's with now, Moonlight Therapeutics. Samir, glad to have you on, and over to you.
Thanks, Amin, and thanks for everyone joining here. So I'm going to try to give you more of a personal story here and intersperse some stories along with some key insights that I had in my particular journey. I'll try to touch on a variety of topics, hoping to ignite some sort of interest in some of these for the Q&A. So feel free to ask about any of the things that I sort of bring up, because there's a lot of different points in the process. And my particular story starts kind of really almost like 15, 20 years ago. I graduated from UC Berkeley in chemical engineering, and I was a student thinking I was going to go into Silicon Valley, which is where Berkeley is, right near Silicon Valley, and go into working with something in the computing world. And very quickly in undergrad, I realized that was not something I was interested in. And so I was fortunate to work for a little bit of time while I was still in school at a company that was working on developing treatments for different diseases. And that kind of got me interested in that. And so I went to go work for that, but I also realized I wanted to go back to grad school. So I'm going to tell the journey of my academics when I started to pursue my PhD at Georgia Tech and Emory, and then what the research that I did there led up to the starting of my first company, which was called Clearside Biomedical. And then the sort of exit for that was an IPO that we had. And then me leaving that company to go on to found the second company, which is the one that Amin mentioned, Moonlight Therapeutics. And I'll start here in Atlanta. This is the Georgia Tech campus from a very high view. And when I came here, I came from California, and this is my first time in the South. And it was a bit of a sticker shock for me. Not as big as when I moved from India to the US, but I was much younger then. And in particular, when I joined Georgia Tech, I joined the chemical engineering department / biomedical engineering. And this was the building that I spent most of my time in. The campus is extremely beautiful. They're constantly changing it. And so I was very fortunate. I think I walked this pretty much every day for a good 6 years. And there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in Atlanta, not just in the tech world, but in pharmaceuticals and biotech and medical devices, those kinds of things, though it's not entirely known for that. So in 2005, when I joined to pursue my PhD here, the lab that I joined was a lab in that building run by Mark Krausnitz. It's a pretty well-known professor out of MIT in Boston. And they had received a $5 million grant. So I was really fortunate when I joined that I really didn't have to worry about funding for my research. And I know a lot of students that join universities and academics world, they sometimes have to fight for that. And it was a 5-year grant, and I had just joined. So pretty much it was going to fund most of my time there. And it was slightly open-ended, but it was joint with another partner university in Atlanta called Emory University, because Georgia Tech is primarily engineering and does not have any medical campus, but Emory does. And so, and the focus was on developing treatments for eye diseases. And what they had was a concept. I promise not to get too technical, but I wanted to show a picture of an eye. And the idea was we were trying to deliver drugs within the layers of the eye. And that was supposed to be my task, find a way to inject things within the layers of the eye. And the discovery that I made and the tools that I developed did not allow me to do that. So I felt like a failure for a good 6 to 12 months. And I didn't want to tell anyone I couldn't do it because somebody else had shown that they could do it. And so I spent a lot of time trying to document what I couldn't do. So, and one of the things I realized I could do was that instead of injecting within the layers of the eye, I actually learned I could inject between the layers of the eye. It's one of the most fascinating things about the eye is it's mostly fluid and everything is sort of movable. Very few of it is set in stone and rigid. And so I figured out I could do that, but I wasn't really certain if it meant anything. And so, but what I did do a good job was documenting it. And so the first thing I learned in that process was that the unexpected, the thing that you didn't plan for, the thing that sometimes I thought was a mistake was actually very valuable. I took that set of data and I went to the professor at Emory and I showed him and I said, I went in there ready to convince him, hey, this is more valuable. And trying to convince him that, hey, since this is more valuable, we should focus on this and that I didn't fail. And it didn't take much convincing because he knew right away how valuable this could be. And so I went in there prepared to be, sort of dejected and told to go back to the lab and fix this because they had just gotten $5 million to do this well-planned set of work. And I'm there trying to tell them they should be doing something different. And so, but he was really receptive. He called in a few other folks and we talked about it and so forth. And very quickly, we sort of changed the focus of the work. And we planned on presenting this at a conference in about mid-2007. Fortunately, my professor at Georgia Tech was quite savvy and he knew the value of filing IP. And so we filed some provisional patents through the university for this discovery and this method of injecting into the parts of the eye with this method. And so the second lesson that I learned in this process was filing patents is extremely important in the world of research and academics and in a lot of other places. But it's important for you to understand when to file, how to file, the important things to file. And in the US in particular, since I know we have an international audience, within the last, I think, say 5 to 10 years or so, it has moved to a first to file. It used to be a first to invent, so that regardless of when you actually filed, if you could prove that you were the first to invent, then you got priority. But now it's first to file. So even if you had the idea early and you can document it, but someone else filed that idea a day before you did, then you're kind of out of luck. And so it's very important to understand these timings and so forth. And so we filed that initial provisional patent, in 2007 before we made any public disclosure about it. And I'll talk about how that was valuable for the company. So I spent a good part of the most of my PhD time, which is about 5 to 6 years here, performing research, basically trying to take this thing that we had discovered, and create some set of data that showed that it was valuable. So it's a lot. It was a lot of work, pretty much, in the lab. But we would go to conferences, and every time we would go to conferences and present, whether it was me or my advisors, um, we would get pretty good reception. And we were engineers going to medical conferences sometimes, and so ophthalmologists were incredibly excited, and pretty soon it started becoming a regular routine of people asking, when can I get this product so that I can inject drugs this way and see what happens? And of course, I had no answer to that because that's not what I was trying to do, though it sounded really appealing to me. So as we got closer to me graduating, the decision came to me pretty quickly that, hey, we should try to commercialize the technology. So it was not something we planned to do. It kind of came about based on what the capabilities of this were, the needs that we saw, based on talking to the scientific community, which included researchers, which were obviously interested, but as well as medical professionals who were actually treating patients. And these were going to be eventually our customers. And so we decided we wanted to turn this into a product. We just didn't know how. And when I say we, it's primarily me trying to push this kind of idea within our lab here at this point between my two advisors. And the first thought we had was, well, why don't we just take it to existing pharma companies, or even medical device companies? And so I actually spent a good amount of time as pitching to those kinds of groups of people. And we talked to several of them, especially those focused in ophthalmology, treating eye diseases. And it was a lot of convincing that we had to do. And when we even managed to convince one company to to have some interest and work with us and try to make this thing happen, they gave us a pretty crummy deal. They basically said they were going to give us very little money, but they would take full control, and they wanted all the IP, the patents and intellectual property associated with it. And we pretty quickly backed away and said, no, we think there's a lot more value here than you're providing, and essentially decided to walk away from that deal. And this was a multi-billion-dollar company, with lots of resources. And so we quickly realized that if we're going to do something, we probably have to do this ourselves. And so I pushed to learn essentially, how do we, actually commercialize this if it's not going to get licensed to a group of people that know how to do it. And this is where I started looking for some help. And actually, this is how I got introduced to Thai. Sometime late 2010, 2011, I started interacting with people in Thai Atlanta to kind of learn and so forth. And so I learned a lot of things, kind of in that process. And the thing that I learned in talking to these people, especially these pharma companies and so forth, is they know a lot of things and they're so-called experts. But if you know your stuff really well, if you know what you're providing, and all that experience that I had of taking the technology and going out talking to ophthalmologists and researchers and patients and so forth in these medical conferences, was my training to tell me there was a real need and we were fulfilling it. And even though they thought there wasn't much there, we knew from firsthand experience in these conversations that there was. And they're sitting usually in big offices and sometimes miss these little things. And so I think the lesson here is, you should know your stuff really well, so that when you go talk to people about it, especially people that you're looking for affirmation from, whether for investment or for partnership or whatever, you can discern what their assessment is as opinion, as fact, as whatever it is, and be confident enough to know that you know your stuff well enough to not be discouraged. And it would have been really easy for me to become discouraged and decide to just drop this. And I'm glad I didn't. And this came from those years of talking to people along the way. And so when we started to commercialize it, or decided to commercialize it, the first step that I knew that had to happen was we needed to make sure our patents were in the right place. And if you recall, we had filed that initial patent back in early 2007. The university in our scenario is the one sort of managing the application, and they had decided that they didn't want to follow through. And so that was a big sort of shock to us, which meant that we had to find a way. If they didn't follow through, then that IP would essentially fall off and may become public knowledge, and we may not ever be able to fully realize this. So we had to make a decision, and I pushed hard for our advisors and stuff to figure out a solution, and we eventually did. We ended up using our own money, hired our own patent attorney, got permission from the university to allow us to do that. They still kept control. We were spending our own money, but they still kept control of it because they owned it, and made sure we did the proper filing. And so that when we actually did end up deciding to start the company, we actually had something to license in. And if we didn't, we actually would have been in a lot of trouble. And so, long story short, in 2011, I graduated in May, and we formed the company in May as well, Clearside Biomedical. And we went through a lot of sort of decision-making processes of how to do this and so forth. But essentially, this was the initial team, the two advisors that I mentioned to you, along with one of my colleagues in the lab who had gotten involved at the sort of last year or so in trying to do the diligence and figure out how this could be commercialized. And then this is where I made a conscious decision, and I said, look, I can insert myself as the leader and try to do this, but I've never done a company like this. We need to bring in an expert into this field to run the company as a CEO. I may know what to do on the R&D side, but I don't know that part. And in return, we were going to have to give up, some control of the company, obviously, and to give it up at an early stage. I had talked to a lot of people that said not to do it, but in the end, I felt timing was more important than anything. And if we waited too long to figure out how to do this, then we might miss that window. And so we went through a lot of trial and error, and we actually thought we had a group of people that actually turned out weren't so good. And I had to go back to this initial team and say, look, we got to fire these guys. It's not going to work. We eventually did. And then it allowed me to come up with a criteria for what it is that we should really want. And we came up with this criteria, and unfortunately, we were able to find someone who fit that criteria. And that ended up eventually being our CEO, Daniel White. And once Daniel was on board, we felt like we now had the team to go out and make the decisions and go move forward. And so we started, trying to put together this plan. And this plan really required that we had this team that sort of filled all the little gaps of what we needed. And so having Daniel filled this big business gap that we had, and he was able to use with his network, get access to other people to say that, we could, if we put this together, have a real team to execute on that plan. And so I'm going to go through a quick timeline of kind of the things that happened in this process, which is we raised approximately $4 million in about 6 to 8 months after we formed the company with this team, which was really amazing. And the Atlanta and the Southeast are not big centers for biotech. It's really California and Boston. And so to get access to this money early on was really awesome. That patent that we had filed about 6 months later was awarded. And so we had our first official patent. And then we were able to test in the product in patients. In the U.S., there's a lot of regulatory kind of hurdles to get through. So we were creative and found a way to do that actually in Mexico to give us some idea of where we were. That allowed us to raise another $8 million shortly after. And then this time we got a pharma partner. We raised another $16 million about a year and a half to 2 years later. We had started a clinical trial after that second raise, and the data from that trial came out shortly after. That was positive. We got clinical trial results on efficacy. So first was safety on efficacy. Shortly after that, with the third raise, and then we actually started a trial on another indication, so treating another disease, and we saw efficacy results on that. So very quickly, we were able to go from this concept that was in a lab all the way to what was then an IPO with that set of data. And really, clinical data in people is extremely valuable in the biotech pharma world. You can do all these kinds of stuff in animal studies, which we could do at the university and with small amounts of money. But the clinical trials and those kinds of things take enormous amounts of money. We were able to do that only because of the setting up a company and raising this kind of money. And the final results for this particular product came out in 2018, well after the IPO, that showed really good efficacy. And this is the press release that was released as a result of that. And don't worry about the details of it, but essentially the people's in 50% or 47% of the people that got the treatment improved their vision dramatically from this treatment. And this is the product, and this is kind of what it looks like. It has, it's a self-contained sort of injector device with a drug sort of built into it that you can load into. And so what were some of the lessons that I learned? Well, in this particular world in biotech pharma, it takes a lot of money. We raised about 50 million total actually in private money before we went public, another 50 million through the IPO. And then even after the IPO, we raised probably more money through the public markets. We still had no sales, no product approval, no significant revenue in the company. And they still have no sales yet as at this point even. So, but I've managed to raise well over 150 to probably $250 million now. Since we jumped straight into VCs, we got significantly diluted. So that was kind of an experience for me to go through to understand kind of that process. The value of human data that I mentioned to you is extremely kind of valuable versus animal data. And when you get to that stage, you become a totally different kind of company, and the perception of investors for you as to what you are. And what I learned was I was in academics, I was a good researcher, but if I had stayed at that level and I had not kind of adapted to the business world and to the pharma biotech drug development world, then I would have become less and less relevant as the company grew. And that was a really important learning. And I would tell everybody, as you go through this process, and if you're in a company and a startup at some point, if you yourself don't grow as the company grows, then your value to the company, I think, starts to diminish as to what you can offer the company, because the company is like a living thing and it's growing. And if you can't keep up with it, then you're not going to be able to kind of give it the attention that it needs. And that's not to say that I did a great job. It's just something I really learned and probably could have done much better. And the one thing I would advise is, through this process, is definitely expand your network and your skill set as you go through this kind of journey. And this is something that I spent a lot of time trying to do, sort of at the late stage, when I could have done it a lot earlier. And so this was the full sort of spectrum of what happened. But what I didn't mention to you was shortly after the IPO, I decided to leave the company, which was a very tough decision for me. This was something that I invented. I had figured out a plan for. That plan turned out, the first product we decided to pursue actually turned out to be, going really well. But things in the company had been evolving to a point where it just didn't seem like I wanted to be there anymore. And once we had the IPO, the plans for the next few years seemed pretty much set. So I knew where things were headed. And so I decided to leave, and I spent a decent amount of time, basically self-reflecting and trying to decide, what to do next. I spent a few months in that process, and I realized, that at heart, I'm an entrepreneur and I really want to go through this journey again. And I've always been thinking about what to do next. And so I spent some time trying to figure out what it is that next thing was, but because I knew I had several ideas. And back when I was in still even at Clearside, I had learned about allergies and how people were doing things with allergies. And I had a friend who has been doing research in allergies. And so I called him up and we started talking and realized that he may have something that may be useful. And so I called Vladimir, who was my colleague at the previous company, who had also left Clearside, and we started doing diligence and trying to evaluate what could we do in allergies. And we realized that food allergies was another area that really had a big unmet need. And so we put together some technology that Harvinder had, and after diligence, decided to start a company which we called Moonlight Therapeutics to develop a treatment for food allergies, and in particular, the allergy that we're pursuing is peanut allergy. And we did this around 2017, about a year after I left Clearside. And this process, now I was at a different stage. The first time we started, we felt kind of just riding the wave of the process, and really not feeling like we were in much of a driver's seat in this case. And this time we could be a little bit more deliberate. The success of the previous company affords some luxury of time and ability to make those kinds of decisions. And so the approach that we took for this one was not to go directly to VCs, but we thought about alternative sort of funding mechanisms. And what we did was we pursued non-dilutive funding. At least here in the US, there are a number of federal grants available to businesses. And in 2019, we were awarded $2.5 million from the National Institutes of Health, one of the largest health funding agencies here in the US, and to allow us to do some of this early stage work. And that's what we've been doing so far. And we're now starting to pursue the usual sort of private funding approaches in this coming year, now that we have some good data and handle around what we want to do. And there's a lot of pros and cons about this, and if anybody has any questions, we can talk about it. But it's non-dilutive, so you don't lose any equity at all, and you get to maintain a lot of control. But on the con side, it's a very slow process. It requires lots of paperwork, a significant planning, and you need to understand how all of this fits in with your business goals, because the goals of the funding agency and so forth can be different. But in the end, if you can get it, it's extremely valuable, and it can go a long way towards validating your approach. And my final thought here is that there's a lot of things going on, and there are a lot of ups and downs in this process. And in the IPO process, that looks like a single event, but we spent 2 years trying to plan for that. And getting the story together and modifying it and constantly talking to people and so forth. And all these things can get really trying and so forth. So is one thing to always keep in mind is have some fun along the way. Make sure you make some friends, because in the end, independent of the results, that's going to stick with you hopefully longer than anything else. And this is where Thai Atlanta and Thai and that organization and being connected to a group of people going through similar processes and so forth made a big difference for me, is to have that support structure to get there. And I'm going to just stop here and try to open it up for your questions. And I just try to touch on a variety of different aspects of this journey, and leave it open for you guys to see what kind of interest you guys have. And so thanks. I really appreciate you guys willing to hear what I've gone through, and happy to talk about anything in particular.
Thanks, Samir. Really refreshing to hear that journey all over again. You've been a part of the Thai Atlanta network for a while now, and I think really appreciate you taking the time to articulate the success and really the lessons learned as well. So I think to start off with, would love to kind of, let's say, take it back to when you were talking about, I think the decision around going forward with the grants, right? I think explain a little bit more about what that decision in going forward with the grant route?
Okay, I mean, I'm not sure if you, but I
Can you hear
lost
me?
your audio there. So
Okay,
I got a
my
little bit of
bad.
it. I think you asked me about the grant process, right? Is that?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, and so the grants are really structured. So they're originally designed to fund academics. So the system is almost exactly the same for businesses as it is for academics. So really, what you're applying to is a group of academics, but you're essentially adding the business component to your story. So when you apply for these kinds of grants, you have to think actually like as an academic, but put your business hat on as well and say there's a business potential for this. And so what you have to do a lot of sort of groundwork up ahead of time to say, what is it that they're usually looking for when they want to approve something like this? So if you have a business plan for a particular idea or technology, what you want to try to do is tailor your message of some component of what you are doing to the folks that are going to be reviewing this to make that happen. And there's a lot of check boxes because it's a government agency and so forth that you have to meet in order to do that. So you have to do the legwork up front to make sure you can check all those boxes and fit within that criteria. And then present a story, a plan that makes sense. And usually the funding agency will help you with that, but it is, as with any sort of high bureaucracy kind of setup, there's a lot of things you'll have to spend a lot of time figuring out on your own. And the best way is probably to talk to people that have done it in the past. But what it offers you is, we're talking on the range of probably usually hundreds of thousands of dollars. In our case, we applied for a much larger grant, mostly because we had the business experience to be able to tell a bigger story. And we had the academic, Harvinder, our scientific founder, and we could put both stories together and tell a more cohesive story. And with our business experience, we could speak to the long-term kind of potential of what we could do. And so we were able to convince NIAID, which is actually the funding agency that's dealing with COVID, that we had a plan for this food allergy treatment. And they were really receptive. And we're actually working with them now for successive grants and so forth to fund our clinical trials. And so if you need, well, what's great about it is you could be very early stage and still that you could get their interest because it is very academic and research oriented. So I would encourage anybody who has something meaningful on that research early academic side, if you're not quite yet ready for private investment and so forth, to look into that as an alternative, because like I said, it's non-dilutive. You get to keep control, and usually the agencies are pretty hands-off once you get the money.
Very good to know. So can you, and just to continue on with this, just had one more kind of piece of it for the audience members to hear, is that, how are these terms typically laid out as? So are they usually consistent across the different grants, or did you have to specifically choose one that aligned with the terms that you wanted, or are they usually just across the board pretty the same?
Well, like anything, you have to find a fit. Every agency has a particular sort of direction as to what their importance are. So NIAID, in our case, is focused on allergies, and within allergies, they have a list of priorities, and they have some what they call funding announcements, which tell them, hey, these are the things we're interested in. So you make sure you find where you fit well, and you talk to that particular group. So when you submit your application, you submit it and say, I want it to be reviewed by these groups of folks. And so the right audience is reviewing it. Second, the dollar amounts that you're asking for are usually already set. They tell you what the max you can ask for per year is. And so in our case, the first year or whatever is usually in the several $100,000 range. And then if you move on to more successive years where you're showing success, you can get close to $1 million per year in funding. And there's restrictions on what you can use that money for. As an example, you can't use it to pay for your IP. You can't use it to pay patent lawyers or patent fees. And so those kinds of restrictions exist. So finding that fit is important. And every agency is different. Department of Defense, if you apply there, they have a different set of requirements. The National Science Foundation has different ones. And so you need to do some legwork to find that fit.
So now obviously you've gone through two different teams and you kind of know about kind of, one journey with taking institutional funding and then with the IPO and then now going with this direction. How do you really get the team to really also buy into the process that you have? Is it something that's usually very transparent, or is it something that you also need to get buy-in from the team? Because, you mentioned that, with the cons, it being a slow process. And I know that there's probably still, information that's needed for specific elements of the grant or even follow-ups that are needed. So how does that dialogue go with your team? Because now you're taking this approach, which has a lot more, I think, positives for the team to initially come on, but usually I know there's probably buy-in needed. So what does that look like?
Yeah, you definitely need buy-in because everything comes down to kind of timing and what your time horizon is and your level of commitment, right? And the you should probably start essentially even before you go through this is making sure that everyone is aware of what the implications are of these various processes. And when I presented this, and probably when people think about it, you just think of it. This is sort of a linear path. You just think one way. I mean, you're doing multiple things at the same time, and so what you really need to get everybody on board is, hey, we're going to try a couple different things. We may be applying several grants. We may be going to angel investors. We may be going to, different kinds of funding mechanisms. We have a long-term plan of what do we want to get to. Some intermediate things we would like to get done. And if one of those things kind of comes out as a lead to start with, then we're going to run with this. And you get overall buy-in because eventually, even if you get the grant, if you can't get the team that you propose in there to follow through on it and so forth, then that money and all that effort you just put in is down the drain. And so the way I usually talk about it is think longer term. None of this is a 3-month, 6-month plan. Don't expect it to work the first time around. Expect that you'll get revisions, you'll need to reapply, that kind of stuff, and build that into your sort of expectations. And I think that way, people that you're working with usually have a little bit better understanding, as opposed to you hyping it up and saying how great it is, we're going to get it. It's nice to be optimistic, but in the end, if it doesn't happen, then you might have people fall away and not want to participate anymore.
Yeah, good insights. And I'm sure that you're still kind of articulating or noting down all your lessons that you're learning through this process as well.
Yeah.
With someone that's had experience with patents, let's talk about that just for a second, because we had a question come in. It's obviously very valuable in the med device space, but let's talk about in the tech sector, right? Because, everything being tech enabled, where if you look at patents there, you can copy and paste that, that patent, make a small change, and where then, that invalidates the patent. So give us some insights and what you would recommend to entrepreneurs really going through that journey in the tech sector about, filing for the patent and then really structuring in a way where it actually is that it's a protected value proposition versus something that could be, invalidated with a minor change.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I don't have a lot of expertise on the tech side, but in general, in the patent world, usually what happens, and I think I mentioned at the beginning that we filed a provisional patent, and at least the way it works here is that when you file a provisional patent, you are given essentially a stake in the ground, saying, "Hey, you've got something here," and you have the general sort of makeup of what it is. And the provisional, as someone described to me back when I started, was it could very well be something that's on a napkin that you put together, and you're just going to scan that in, and that's going to be your provisional. Usually, it shouldn't be that crude, but it can be. And but in any case, that essentially buys you time. So you have about a year here in the U.S. To work on that provisional, figure out what it should actually look like in terms of a patent, if you're thinking about it as a patent. And then if nothing comes of it, it usually just goes away. It technically will not see the light of day after that. So you're sort of protected in that world. So if you want to just buy yourself some time, it's a good way to buy yourself some time. But before you even get to that point, or during that process, you should probably figure out some things actually need to be patent protected. Some things may end up just being know-how, or some things you may not, the timing of when you file may be the critical thing. And you have to figure out in the life of the company or the product that you're trying to develop, at what point do you want it protected? You know, at what point do you want it that you're going to be talking to people, you're going to disclose the details of it in such a way that you want protection? And is that protection sufficient with just a trade secret type understanding? Or is it going to need to be protected by IP? And the one thing I learned in our field is there's very good strategy around, it's not simply, I have this idea, I know what it is, and I'm going to protect that. There are patent lawyers, especially the ones that focus on strategy instead of the tactics, are the ones that you want to get involved early, because what they can do is say, I want X protected, but in order to do that, I need to go everything around this piece of particular, if you think of it as real estate, this piece of property, I'm going to go around and protect all these other things around it, so that eventually when I protect this one, it will have this sort of wall of protection. And that's what's going to keep me from getting sort of eaten up by people when they finally see what I have. And so you need to think strategy in the early part more than tactics, and find experienced people that can help think that strategy through. And it will pay dividends if you do end up becoming successful.
Very insightful, and I hope that anyone that is looking in terms of patents or process, that they're starting early, like you said, and then also have the full strategy that's in mind. So, speak to, just stick on that same conversation, so speak to some of the tactics that may be involved that are important, because obviously, the patent lawyer or the person that's doing some of the, articulation for it to be all structured properly. So what is your team doing in that, during that meantime? Are they facilitating any next steps with, continuing on with it, or are they waiting for an answer? So what is that, I would say, provisional patent approval, or when you get the acceptance, what does that downtime look like for the company? Are you guys, what are you guys focusing on so that you guys don't lose momentum?
Right. Well, as it pertains to patenting and so forth, the value of the patent is in the data that's within it. So from my perspective, my goal is to generate meaningful data that can support the claims that I'm going to ask the patent attorney to put in the patent, because a patent is its claims for the most part. And so the expert legal folks are going to draft the claims in a way with legalese language to protect the basic thing that you want protected, but you have to provide the supporting structure to it, which is data. And so your job in the company should be to generate data that can be supportive of that. And not all of it will be used, but if you stop generating data, you're basically, that's the food for the patent. You're going to kill off your patent. Okay. So, and it is in my mind, it is no single patent. If you have an experienced group of advising you, you will be filing multiple patents, and there'll be a strategy around why you're filing it that way and how you're doing it. And so you're constantly feeding this growing supply of things. Of course, I'm taking the whole money thing out of the picture, because with all of these things, there's going to be more and more money tied to it. But if you have the resources to do it, that's what you should be doing. And so you as a company should be working on your product and everything else, but you should be generating data to feed that. And the more interesting the data, the better the chances that your patent attorneys will be able to convince the authorities that this is something unique.
Great insight, Samir. So our next panel up is going to talk about exits and lessons learned with, multiple ventures. So I wanted to, obviously you spoke about Clearside and that journey, and now with Moonlight Therapeutics. What are you doing now or thinking about from the lessons that you learned from that previous company about keeping that exit in mind and then really getting yourselves geared up for that? I know that, obviously, someone that is now a serial entrepreneur, in terms of the team that you're building, I know that you're keeping that in mind and ensuring that any of the mistakes that you may have made during Clearside or any of the structuring that was done, what are you doing now to structure Moonlight Therapeutics a little bit differently, or what is the one main takeaway that you have from Clearside to improve what the structure is for Moonlight?
Yeah, I think it's very important. especially now in this position that I am, where I'm not just sort of in charge of the R&D and so forth of the company and so forth, but as the CEO, as someone in charge of the whole company in a sense, I have to be thinking about, as I mentioned, there's a lot of dollars that go into it, and the dollars that come into this are going to be dollars eventually that are going to want to come out even bigger than they went in, right? So the investors are going to want an exit. So you have to start with the exit in mind all the time when you're talking to those guys that are going to get tens of millions of dollars into it. And so having a clear set path at where multiple exits exist and what they look like based on actual real data or real world understanding of how this is going to play out. Since the exit is for us maybe 5 to 8 years out, you kind of have to have an understanding of what that story is. And so for me, I spend a lot of time projecting as to what it's going to look like and telling that story of what that exit scenario will look like, and then backtracking my way as to why I'm doing what I'm doing to get to that.
Samir, I really appreciate you sharing your time with us, and wishing you continued success. Excited to hear about, hopefully in the near future, about the success story that you'll have with Moonlight Therapeutics. I think you guys are doing some awesome stuff, and in a very unique niche to be able to solve a big problem, as we talked about before. But just continuing on, any last feedback or takeaway or advice that you would want to give to the audience, as an actionable next step for folks that are now securing funding and then really now going into that growth scale mode, that you would want to share, just to tell them that, hey, this is some of the next steps that you guys can look to really continuing on that growth mode, and some things to be mindful along that journey.
Yeah, I would just say always remember, money comes with personality. So know the personality that is coming with the money. And anytime you talk to anybody with money, put the money aside at some point and think about the person, the group, whoever it is, and figure out whether that personality fits with what you're doing. Because sometimes you don't have a choice, but if you do, don't jump immediately into access to money if the personality is not a good fit. Because once the personality and the relationship sours, no amount of money can sometimes fix that. And then it doesn't really matter how much money you have, because you may never get it to work.
Wise words from a wise entrepreneur. Thanks, Samir. Thanks again for sharing your time. Look forward to catching up with you. And we're going to be going into a quick break, and then that we'll be setting up our exit panel with lessons learned. Thank you, Samir.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Bye.